I was never meant to be inside that glass-walled penthouse that night. The invitation list had been curated with surgical precision: executives, senior strategists, rising stars, and a handful of spouses who fit a certain aesthetic. It was the kind of corporate celebration designed less for gratitude and more for spectacle. Crystal chandeliers dripped light over marble floors. A string quartet played near the infinity balcony overlooking the harbor. Imported champagne flowed like water, and every conversation felt rehearsed, polished, strategic. 3 hours before the event, my wife called me. Her tone carried that honeyed softness she used only when she wanted something difficult. She said one of the reserved seats had opened up unexpectedly, and it would mean a lot if I came. We had been drifting for nearly half a year. Missed dinners, clipped conversations, nights when she came home smelling like cologne that wasn't mine but swore it was just the office. There had been one night she didn't come home at all. The argument that followed nearly split us in two. So when she asked, I didn't hesitate. I pressed my charcoal blazer, the one I'd worn at a gala the year before, shaved carefully, and drove across the city with a calm expression hiding a mind that never stopped calculating. When I stepped onto the terrace, I immediately understood the ecosystem. Laughter rose in practiced bursts. Deals were hinted at but never fully spoken. Compliments were currency. My wife hurried toward me when she saw me near the entrance, relief flashing across her face before it was replaced by something more controlled. She wore a deep emerald gown I had surprised her with months earlier when we were still pretending everything was fine. She kissed me quickly, too quickly, then looped her arm through mine and steered me into the current of executives. That was when I saw him, her division director, early 50s, perfectly tailored navy suit, salt threaded through dark hair in a way that screamed cultivated authority. He stood at the center of a semicircle of employees, holding court like a monarch disguised as middle management. The moment his eyes landed on me, I saw the assessment, the faint smirk, the subtle narrowing that measured worth in seconds. "So this is the legendary husband," he said loudly enough for the group to hear. He dragged out the word legendary as if it were satire. The surrounding cluster laughed, not because it was funny, but because survival in corporate hierarchies often requires laughter on command. I extended my hand. He took it, squeezed just a bit too hard, the universal gesture of insecure dominance. "I expected someone larger," he added, tilting his head. My wife shifted beside me but stayed silent. The director asked what I did, and when she mentioned I worked primarily from home managing private investments, he let out a theatrical hum. "Ah, flexible schedule. Must be convenient while she handles the real pressure." More laughter. I smiled politely and said nothing. Silence unsettles people. It forces them to confront the echo of their own behavior. Over the next hour, the comments continued, each wrapped in faux charm. He asked if I needed help navigating the wine list, wondered aloud if I found boardroom discussions intimidating, suggested that perhaps I should shadow his team for a day to understand what real deadlines looked like. The crowd performed their obligation, chuckles, nods, glances. My wife attempted weak diversions, but she never drew a line, never said stop. I watched her carefully. Not him, her. The way she laughed half a second too late, the way she kept smoothing her dress, the way her eyes flicked toward him, seeking approval even as he diminished her husband. And I realized something unsettling. She was afraid of losing her place in that orbit, afraid of disrupting the gravitational pull of corporate validation. I let it all happen. I cataloged it, because sometimes information is more powerful than retaliation. Just after 10, the music softened. A murmur rippled through the terrace as the company's founder stepped onto a raised platform near the glass railing. He was older, mid-70s perhaps, with the composed posture of someone who had survived multiple economic collapses and still emerged wealthier each time. Conversations tapered off instantly. He tapped a spoon against his crystal glass and thanked everyone for their dedication during a turbulent fiscal cycle. Then his gaze swept the crowd and stopped on me. Not vaguely, directly. "Before we conclude," he said, voice smooth and deliberate, "I would like to recognize an individual whose contribution cannot be overstated." My wife stiffened beside me. The director's expression remained smug, unaware. When liquidity vanished and lenders withdrew their support earlier this year, the founder continued, one private partner stepped forward without hesitation. He provided not only substantial capital but strategic restructuring guidance that preserved every position in this company. A hush spread outward like a shockwave. That partner is here tonight. He raised his glass toward me. Our principal investor and advisory board lead. It was as if the air had been vacuumed from the terrace. Heads turned in synchronized disbelief. The director's face drained of color. The hand holding his drink trembled ever so slightly. The same people who had laughed moments ago now stared at me as though I had shifted into a different form. I didn't grin, I didn't posture, I simply inclined my head in acknowledgement. The founder stepped down and shook my hand warmly, thanking me publicly for steadfast belief when others panicked. The applause that followed was hesitant at first, then urgent, opportunistic, people recalibrating in real time. The director attempted to recover his composure, but confidence built on assumption collapses quickly when exposed. He approached me, voice lower now. I wasn't aware, he muttered. Clearly, I replied evenly, nothing more. Sometimes restraint is sharper than insult. As I moved through the crowd, introductions came rapidly, sudden respect blooming like artificial flowers under fluorescent light. My wife stood frozen, absorbing the shift. Her expression cycled through shock, confusion, and something closer to realization. When I passed her director again, I leaned in slightly. We should review your department's retention metrics next quarter, I said calmly. Efficiency has been interesting. His jaw tightened. He nodded too quickly. The power dynamic had inverted, but I felt no triumph, only clarity. The party continued, but the atmosphere had changed entirely. Conversations grew measured. Laughter sounded careful. The director eventually retreated to a corner near the bar, suddenly preoccupied with his phone. On the drive home, the city lights blurred across the windshield. My wife remained silent for several blocks before finally whispering, "Why didn't you tell me?" Her voice trembled, not with anger but with something closer to exposure. I kept my eyes on the road. "Because I needed to see something," I answered. She turned toward me, eyes glossy. "You let him humiliate you," I exhaled slowly. "No, I let him reveal himself, and I needed to know if you would step in when you believed I had no leverage." The words landed heavily. The car felt smaller. "That's not fair," she whispered. "I was protecting my career." I nodded. "Exactly." When we reached home, the silence between us felt heavier than any argument we'd had before. I told her quietly that I needed space and took the guest room, not out of spite, but out of necessity. Because what had unfolded on that rooftop wasn't about public humiliation. It was about loyalty under pressure, about whether respect is conditional on status. I lay awake long after midnight, replaying not his words but her inaction, the subtle laugh, the averted eyes, the absence of defense. That absence echoed louder than any insult he delivered. Morning arrived with muted light filtering through the curtains. I found her in the kitchen, still wearing last night's makeup smudged beneath sleepless eyes. Coffee sat untouched in front of her. She stood as I entered, voice already breaking. She admitted the late nights weren't always mandatory, that she had vented about our marriage to colleagues who found it entertaining, that she had allowed external validation to reshape how she saw me. No affair, she insisted, but erosion. Gradual, quiet erosion. She said she didn't recognize the version of herself who stayed silent. I listened without interruption. Because sometimes the most powerful response isn't correction. It's allowing someone to confront their own reflection. She said the words slowly at first, as if testing their weight before allowing them to land fully in the room. She told me she had started measuring her worth through performance reviews instead of through the quiet strength of our partnership. That the office had become an arena where validation was rationed and approval felt addictive. In that environment, she admitted, she had begun to see me not as her equal but as a variable, something that either elevated her image or complicated it. Hearing that didn't ignite anger the way I expected. It produced something colder, recognition. She confessed that she had laughed at jokes about me before that night, subtle ones during after-hours drinks, because challenging them might have made her seem defensive or insecure. She said she convinced herself it was harmless, that it was just social maneuvering. But when I stood there on that terrace absorbing insult after insult without reacting, she realized too late that she had aligned herself with the wrong side of the room. Not publicly, not dramatically, but through silence. And silence, she now understood, was a vote. I asked her if she understood the difference between a mistake and a pattern. A mistake happens in a moment. A pattern develops over time, layer by layer, until it shapes identity. What she described wasn't a single lapse, it was a gradual shift in allegiance. She nodded, tears gathering but not falling yet. She said she had been afraid of falling behind, afraid of being seen as soft, afraid that defending me would somehow make her appear less ambitious. That confession lingered between us. Fear had guided her choices more than loyalty had. I told her something I hadn't admitted out loud before. I had sensed the drift months ago. The emotional recalibration. The way our conversations began to feel like status briefings instead of connection. I hadn't confronted it directly because part of me wanted to believe it would correct itself. Instead, it widened. Then she said something that shifted the air in the room. She told me she had already drafted a resignation letter. Not because of the public revelation of my role in the company, but because the culture there had begun reshaping her values. She described the way competitiveness blurred into cruelty, how executives rewarded aggression disguised as confidence, how ridicule passed as humor. She said standing on that rooftop watching the director unravel forced her to confront what she had tolerated for too long. I asked whether she was reacting emotionally to embarrassment or making a strategic decision. She answered without hesitation. Both. That honesty mattered. She wasn't pretending moral purity. She was acknowledging consequence. Over the next several days, I observed carefully. Words are easy in the aftermath of shock. Action is harder. She scheduled a formal meeting with human resources. She requested an exit interview. She documented incidents she had previously dismissed as minor. I did not interfere. I did not leverage my position. I remained deliberately uninvolved. If she was going to reclaim integrity, it had to be hers, not borrowed from my authority. When Friday arrived, she asked if I would accompany her to the office building, not to intimidate anyone, not to posture, simply to walk in beside her. The lobby atmosphere changed the moment we entered. Recognition rippled outward. Conversations quieted mid-sentence. Perception had shifted permanently. Her director was absent that day, an unexpected personal leave. Whether coincidence or avoidance, it didn't matter. She handed her resignation to the regional administrator with steady hands. No dramatic speech, no theatrics, but before leaving she requested a brief moment on the open floor. Her colleagues gathered reluctantly. She didn't mention my investment. She didn't reference the rooftop announcement. Instead, she spoke about accountability. About how ambition without boundaries corrodes character. She admitted she had allowed professional pressure to distort her priorities. She apologized, not to the company, but to herself for compromising values she once believed were non-negotiable. The room was uncomfortably silent. Some faces reflected guilt, others calculation. We walked out together without looking back. Outside, the air felt different, less filtered, less performative. She exhaled as though releasing something she had been carrying for years. But resignation alone does not repair trust. The following weeks were uneven. Some evenings we talked for hours about where the fracture began. Other nights we sat in quiet tension, neither certain how to rebuild something that had thinned so gradually. Trust doesn't regenerate overnight. It reconstructs through consistency. Through transparency that feels almost excessive at first. She began volunteering information instead of waiting to be asked. She stopped curating narratives for external approval. She reintroduced small rituals we had abandoned, shared breakfasts, evening walks, conversations without phones on the table. 3 months later, I received a call from the founder. His tone was measured but direct. An internal review had been conducted following multiple formal complaints. The director's conduct extended far beyond one evening's arrogance. Patterns of intimidation, subtle harassment, retaliatory evaluations. Apparently, my public identification as investor had emboldened others to speak openly. When the illusion of untouchability cracked, suppressed accounts surfaced. He was no longer with the company. I listened without satisfaction. There was no triumph in hearing that someone's career had collapsed, only acknowledgement that unchecked behavior eventually accumulates consequence. Systems correct themselves slowly, but they do correct. My wife secured a position at a smaller consultancy shortly afterward. The environment was different, leaner, less hierarchical, more transparent. On her first day, she set clear boundaries about after-hours expectations. She introduced me at their quarterly mixer not as an accessory but as her partner, speaking with grounded pride instead of anxious calculation. I noticed the difference immediately. She no longer scanned rooms for approval before speaking. She no longer measured jokes for strategic value. She engaged fully, confidently, without compromising alignment. Watching that shift mattered more than any apology she had offered. Sometimes I still think about that terrace high above the harbor, about the string quartet, the glittering skyline, the director's smirk dissolving in real time. But the memory no longer centers on humiliation or reversal. It centers on exposure, exposure of character, of priorities, of fragility hidden beneath status. That evening could have become a story about revenge. Instead, it became a mirror, a forced reflection neither of us could ignore. We both had retreated in different ways, she into ambition, me into quiet detachment. The rooftop confrontation didn't create our fracture. It illuminated it under unforgiving light. Now when we attend events together, the dynamic is different. She introduces me first, not as validation of my influence but as acknowledgement of partnership. If a comment drifts toward disrespect, she addresses it calmly and immediately, not aggressively, not defensively, simply clearly, and I no longer rely on silence as a test. We speak directly when something unsettles us. We correct early instead of observing quietly. The lesson was never about hierarchy or leverage. It was about conditional respect, about what happens when identity becomes negotiable in exchange for acceptance. That night forced us to decide what mattered more, position or principle, and in the aftermath, stripped of spectacle, we chose deliberately instead of passively.